Hi, everybody. Welcome. I can't tell you. This is a Shahachianu moment.
Yes.
You're going to say a blessing
For
study
of Torah.
We're going to say Shahachianu right now because to be together in a learning environment, really together, you guys count too, those of you who are out in virtual land. We love you too. But this is very special. So let's just say together, Baruch Atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. We praise you, Adonai, our God, who has given us life, sustained us, and to help us reach this special, wonderful moment together. So welcome to our summer Limud series. This is going to be lots of fun, presented by the Adult Education Committee and our clergy team. We are really excited to present this multi-access program to those here and to those watching from abroad. Tonight, Rabbi Bernstein and Donna Schwartz will explore the conflicts between Joseph and his brothers and what we might learn from that narrative about healing our own family relationships. And of course, this whole series is about family relationships, and you'll have different insights every week. Please note that this session will be recorded for members who wish to review it at a further time. There will be time for questions to be asked towards the end of the program. So hold your questions. Guests in the sanctuary can use the question cards that are out on the table in the lobby. There's cards and pens. And just fill it out at any point and hand it to me. I won't be standing here. I'll be down there. And guests at home, we encourage you to email any questions you may have using the email that my email address that was sent to you with your program reminder either yesterday or today. And note that the resource sheet was also an attachment to that email. So again, welcome, and it's so great to see people here. And we turn it over to you guys.
Welcome, everybody. It is wonderful to be back in the sanctuary with real live people, and the people at home are real live people too. So we are all together in a community of learners, and as Cantor Leader said, our format for tonight and for the other programs is that each of us on the clergy team is paired with a psychotherapist. I will introduce my wonderful partner in a second, Donna Schwartz, and we're going to have a conversation about some of the texts and narratives in the Torah which would lend themselves to a lot of psychotherapy, right? Probably a lot of things in these families that are very contemporary when we think about it. So as Cantor Leader mentioned, you each have a text sheet, and at the end of the text sheet there are some questions just sort of for thoughts. So at different points you might want to have a look at those questions and reflect on those. And as Cantor Leader mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So I wanted to formally introduce my wonderful partner, Donna Schwartz, who has been a member of Temple Rodef Shalom since you were a baby? No, not quite. Kindergarten. So, okay. 1965, so for a number of years. And Donna is a licensed clinical social worker in the District of Columbia as well as in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And she provides psychotherapy for individuals, couples, and families. She has expertise and much experience in the treatment of anxiety, eating disorders, couples counseling, infertility, pregnancy, postpartum anxiety, and depression. And she has advanced clinical training in the treatment of perinatal and postpartum depression. Donna's had a private practice in D.C. for over 25 years. And in addition to her work as a psychotherapist, Donna is an assistant clinical professor at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences, helping to train future physicians. And good, that's great. And in May 2013, she was published as a clinical trial researcher for the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what psychotherapists use to diagnose all kinds of disorders. Donna, for many years, has volunteered here at TRS, running a wonderful educational and support group, the Mother Circle, for women who are not Jewish but who are raising Jewish children. And in her free time, she really enjoys spending time with her husband, Greg, her 2 daughters, and their adorable dog, Mikey, who is a rescue. So welcome, Donna. We're so glad that you're here with us. And I thought, as Cantor Leader mentioned, that we would say another blessing, which is the blessing for the study of Torah, because that's what we're going to be studying tonight. So please join me. I think many of you know it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we are going to start tonight with the narrative of Joseph and his family, which some people actually have called a novella. And what a family it is. You may remember that, that Joseph was the child of Jacob, and Jacob really wanted to marry Rachel. But instead of marrying Rachel, his uncle, who was Rachel's father, did a switcheroo and substituted Leah on the wedding night. We're not even going to go there tonight, but it has some resonance, and that's why I mention it. So although there were sons and a daughter that Jacob had with Leah, the switcheroo wife, who was not supposed to be the first wife. They were sons of not only of Leah, but of Jacob's concubines. And so when Jacob was finally able to marry Rachel, the true love of his life, the 2 sons that he had with Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. So that is the background. So let's look at the first couple of paragraphs here when we first read about Joseph. Now, God remembered Rachel. God heeded her and opened her womb. So she'd been having trouble conceiving. She conceived and bore a son, and she said, God has taken away my disgrace. So she named him Joseph, which is to say, may Adonai add another son for me. After Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, that is Rachel's father, give me leave to go back to my own homeland, because that is where he is going to establish his household. This then is the line of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended the flocks with his brothers as a helper to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And Joseph brought bad reports of them to their father. Now Israel, that's Jacob, loved Joseph best of all his sons, for he was the child of his old age, and he had made him an ornamented tunic. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him, Joseph, more than any of his brothers, they hated him, so they could not speak a friendly word to him. So, Donna, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about communication in this family and in family relationships, and how that impacts what sort of impact that has on the family relationships.
Well, I can't really speak exactly for Joseph, but in most family relationships, communication is the key to understanding each other. And certainly Jacob kind of set things up for Joseph to have a hard time communicating with his brothers because he was favored. So, but one thing is to know your own communication style. There's a great book by an author, Gary Chapman. It's called The Five Love Languages, and it talks about communication style. And it's good to kind of know what you need and how you communicate with other people. Would it have been helpful for Jacob to know that about himself? Probably, when he was talking to Joseph and Joseph's brothers. So that's something to think about when we're trying to communicate with our own family members.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask you about the rivalry that's sort of, just baked into this whole system. I mean, somehow Joseph is already set apart because he has a different mother than the others who also have a couple of different mothers. But the idea that that he is going to be kind of spying on them is, that just seems to me to set up a bad dynamic to begin with.
So we kind of wonder why would Jacob do that to him? And it would be a question that I kind of would love to sit down with Jacob and ask him.
I think so.
Can't now, but why would he set that up for his son? One thing may be that he loved Rachel. Really, that was his true love. So Joseph, and then of course his brother Benjamin, might be part of the reason why he set Joseph up with that. He might not have thought that, but I think it's probably more because of his love for Rachel.
Yeah, I agree. And then there's the business with the ornamented tunic that was, so different than anything that the brothers had, which is a tangible sign of this favoritism that Jacob has for this son. Yeah. So let's move on and look at the next bit of text, and it has to do with Joseph's dreams, very, very famous. Once Joseph had a dream in which he told to his brothers, and they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream, which I have dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field, when suddenly my sheaf stood up and remained upright. Then your sheaves gathered around and bowed low to my sheaf." His brothers answered, "Do you mean to reign over us? Do you mean to rule over us?" And they hated him even more for his talk about dreams. He dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I have had another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told it to his father and brothers, his father berated him. "What," he said to him, "is this dream you have dreamed? Are we to come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow low to you to the ground?" So his brothers were wrought up at him, and his father kept the matter in mind. So I wanted to ask Donna what the meaning and significance of Joseph's dreams might be. I don't know that we need a skilled psychotherapist to interpret those dreams, but in general, if you could shed some light on the relationship between our dreams and what's going on in our internal life and what is happening in our subconscious.
I don't know if some people can really remember their dreams and write them down right away. I'm not so good at that. But if you can, it kind of can shed light of maybe what you're thinking about, maybe some challenges, maybe some joys in your life. Dreams can kind of project what you may want to work on and think about. So that's something to think about when it comes to dreams. Certainly Joseph wanted to be powerful, and he used his dreams really to kind of tell his brothers how powerful he's going to be and how they need to bow down to him.
Right, and the ironic thing is that these dreams in a way do come true. So we might wonder if Joseph is, I don't know that he's actually called a prophet, but he does have these dreams that, in essence, do come true because perhaps he is not ruling over his siblings and his parents, but he is going to become a very powerful person, as we'll see. So, here's this young man who's kind of full of himself, I would say, maybe an adolescent, and he's trying to work out a lot of things without much awareness, it seems to me, of how this is being perceived by his brothers.
Mm-hmm. And also the fact that Jacob kind of gave him that power by favoring him.
Exactly, yeah. So Donna, would you feel comfortable reading the next couple of pages, a couple paragraphs of text? We're on page 2.
The brothers conspired to get rid of Joseph. They saw him from afar, and before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we can say, a savage beast devoured him. We shall see what comes of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he tried to save him from them. He said, let us not take his life. And Reuben went on, shed no blood. Cast him into the pit out in the wilderness, but do not touch him yourselves, intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. When Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the ornamented tunic that he was wearing, and took him to cast him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to a meal. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. There are camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum to be taken to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what do we gain by killing our brother, covering up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let us not do away with him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh. His brothers agreed. When Mennonite traders passed by, then pulled Joseph up out of the pit, they sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he rent his clothes. Returning to his brothers, he said, the boy is gone. Now what am I to do? Then they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a kid, and dipped the tunic into the blood. They had the ornamented tunic taken to their father, and they said, we found this. Please examine it. It is your son's tunic or not. He recognized it and said, my son's tunic? A savage beast devoured him? Joseph was torn by a beast? Jacob rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son many days. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, no, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol. Thus his father bewailed him.
So painful. I think what struck me as I was listening was certainly the cruelty to Joseph, but also to the father. I mean, to allow the father to think that his son was dead.
Killed.
Just killed, just stunning, really
Yeah.
stunning, yeah. When we were preparing for this, Donna, we were talking about sometimes how we can feel displaced in our own families or not understood, or sometimes people put us in a box in our families. They see us in a particular way, and that's how we are perceived, and we're not perceived fully as human beings. And I wondered if you could talk a little about that, what it's like, for people not to feel understood in that way by their family.
We were talking about in the sense of the pit and Joseph and how his brothers put him in the pit, and they perceived him as, self-absorbed, himself, because he was talking so much about the dreams. And so Stephanie and I were talking about, sometimes people perceive us one way and put us in the box/pit, and we can't really get out of it. And how do we talk and communicate with our family or friends about who we are and communicate that differently? And I think Joseph had a really hard time with that because he was so self-absorbed about himself. He wanted his brothers to perceive him this way, but yet he didn't realize the impact on him feeling isolated, alone, and not really accepted by his brothers.
And I think that we all play roles in our families of origin. So in my family of origin, my father was the funny person who had a great sense of humor, and I was perceived as serious without much of a sense of humor. So, I knew I had a sense. That's a minor example, but that was kind of my role in the family. The serious child without much of a sense of humor.
That's hard to believe.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. Thank you for standing up for me, Donna. I appreciate it. So when this is something obviously catastrophic, but we all, I think, in our families can play particular roles. Sometimes it's a caregiver, whatever it happens to be.
Or just being, if you're the oldest child or the youngest child, the middle child, what just already society kind of boxes you into.
Right. It has certain expectations of how you're going to act in the world.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. So the next section of text that we're going to look at is one of the 2 times that the brothers go down to Egypt because there's a famine in Canaan. And this was a very common occurrence in the ancient world. The Nile Delta was very fertile, and it was a place that people could go to get food. So this was a very common occurrence. So the brothers traveled to Egypt to obtain food. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to get grain rations in Egypt. And I should say before I continue that at this point, Joseph has had a tremendous reversal of fortune. So we've skipped over a lot, right? Because he goes down to Egypt. He is sold into slavery, or he's a house servant in the home of a high-level Egyptian official, Potiphar. Mrs. Potiphar makes a pass at him. She doesn't have a name, so I call her Mrs. Potiphar. It's Potiphar's wife. And he refuses her, and she kind of stages this whole thing to make it look like he made advances to her, and he ends up being thrown into a dungeon where he interprets dreams. And, I'm refreshing this story that I'm sure everybody knows. And then eventually he rises to a very, very high level position in Egypt where he is sort of Pharaoh's right-hand person. So it's clear that he's not an Egyptian, but he has a tremendous amount of power. So here the brothers are coming down to Egypt to obtain food. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to get grain rations in Egypt, for Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, since he feared that he might meet with disaster. So Benjamin is the younger brother of Joseph, and Rachel dies giving birth to him. Thus, the sons of Israel, Jacob, were among those who came to procure rations, for the famine extended to the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was the vizier of the land. It was he who dispensed rations to all the people of the land. Joseph's brothers came and bowed low to him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he acted like a stranger toward them and spoke harshly to them. He asked them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to procure food." For though Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. So they had not seen him for many, many years. He was a grown man, and he presented, even though he was an Israelite, like an Egyptian. He dressed, I'm sure, very regally, and there was no way that they could have recognized him. So Joseph then proposes how he is going to distribute the food and what they need to do. He says, "Let one of you go and bring your brother, while the rest of you remain confined, that your words may be put to the test, whether there is truth in you. Else, by Pharaoh, you are nothing but spies." And he confined them in the guardhouse for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, "Do this, and you shall live, for I am a God-fearing man. If you are honest men, let one of you brothers be held in a place of detention, while the rest of you go and take home rations for your starving households. But you must bring me your youngest brother, that your words may be verified and that you may not die." So he wants them to bring Benjamin. And they did accordingly. They said to one another, "Alas, we are being punished on account of our brother, because we looked on at his anguish, yet paid no heed as he pleaded with us. That is why this distress has come upon us." Reuben spoke up and said to them, "Did I not tell you, do no wrong to the boy? But you paid no heed. Now comes the reckoning for his blood." They did not know that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between him and them. He turned away from them and wept. Wow. This is all about a lot of anger and hurt that has been accumulating for such a long time. And one of the things that we talked about, Donna, was for us to think about what we have done to diffuse and to mend difficult relationships in our families. And also, I'm curious on your take on Joseph. I mean, in a way, he's almost toying with the brothers. What do you think is behind his actions?
Well, it seems like to me that Joseph hasn't really worked through his anger and his disappointment with his brothers, so he kind of wants to toy with them and play with them, and instead of really thinking through, it's easier to be angry than to be sad and deal with other feelings and emotions. So, Joseph clearly hasn't figured out that his brothers hated him so much, or he felt like they hated him so much, that he was so full of anger and disappointment with them that he didn't really know how to deal with it. So, and finally, the brothers, since they didn't recognize him, he kind of was powerful again. So Joseph kind of was playing out also that piece for him, because he had the power and he could toy with them and, deal with that himself.
So one of the issues that this raises, and I think it goes throughout this part of the Joseph story, is how can we re-enter those relationships that have been so damaged in the past? Because we all know, and we all have those kind of relationships in our families.
Yeah, and we have disappointments and frustrations in relationships, and how do we look at our own feelings and accept people what they can and can't give? It's a really hard thing. Sometimes I'll ask people to write down what can you get in a relationship, what can't you get, and sometimes the can't seems longer than the can, but if we can accept people for who they are, then maybe we can re-enter those relationships. They still might not be exactly what we want. They may be disappointing, but at least maybe we can re-enter those relationships with a different lens.
So what about if it's a family relationship where somebody's really, hurt us? I mean, not literally thrown us into a pit physically, but psychologically maybe
Right.
we felt that they've thrown us into a pit. I mean, how do we, if we're wary, of re-entering or trying to re-engage, what are some ways that people can do that to protect themselves at the same time as...
Well, by looking at the can and can'ts, and also what you can get in the relationship, but also setting up some healthy boundaries for yourself so you take care of yourself, not having too high of expectations of yourself or the other relationship. You start out with something small and see how that goes. But sometimes when something goes well, even if it's small, we get our hopes up and our expectations. And how do you reset that relationship? Because the past sometimes can be what you think the future is going to be, but how do you accept what happened in the past and think about, okay, this is where I'm at now. I can enter by small gestures and giving, but also be cautious and go very slowly. Because sometimes I think when we re-enter a relationship, we think it's going to be this wonderful thing that it was in the past, and a lot of times we're disappointed.
It takes some courage to do that, right? Because in some ways it would be easier to just say, that's it, the heck with it. It's really, it's brave, I think, to try to do that.
Yeah. And forgiveness is bravery, too. It doesn't mean you forget, but forgiveness is brave. And I think about that on Yom Kippur is a big day of atonement where we have the opportunity to forgive and even speak to the people that we feel we have hurt, or if they're not around, we can speak, to ourselves or to God. But we can reset ourselves and remember the past as a lesson, but then maybe re-enter, maybe feeling cleansed.
Oh, I'm so glad that you mentioned, put in a plug for Yom Kippur, because that really is the work of Yom Kippur, is to repair those relationships. And I know people who either in person or over the phone, if it's not somebody that they are able to see in person, over Zoom maybe, will have conversations with people who are important in their lives and say, if there are things that I have done that have hurt you during the year and you have not told me about them, I would like to know, I would like to ask your forgiveness. And I think that's such genius in Judaism because it really is a way of repairing, giving us a way to repair those relationships. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is not only forgiveness, but forgiving. If somebody sincerely asks our forgiveness, Judaism teaches that we are supposed to try to find it in our hearts to forgive them. So we have these mechanisms for repairing relationships.
And also ourselves.
And
Forgiving ourselves.
Absolutely.
Maybe how we reacted and maybe disappointed on those reactions. Because that's what we can control in relationship is our reactions. We can't control the other person's reactions. So that's something to be thinking about too.
Absolutely. And I really was glad to hear you say that the relationship is not going to be what it was. I mean, if we have these wonderful memories of how it was, it may not be that way. Or if our memories are mostly memories of hurt and disappointment, we have to have an open enough heart to be able to imagine that things could be different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we may forgive and decide not to have a relationship with that person, but then we don't hold on to the anger that can really hold us back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so Donna, would you be willing to read the piece of text where it says the brothers' second trip to Egypt?
Sure. But Judah said to him, "The man warned us, 'Do not let me see your faces unless your brother is with you. If you let our brother go with us, we will go down and procure food for you. But if you will not let him go, we will not go down.' For the man said to us, 'Do not let me see your faces unless your brother is with you.' And Israel said, 'Why did you serve me so ill as to tell the man that you had another brother?' They replied, 'But the man kept asking about us and our family, saying, "Is your father still living? Have you another brother?" And we answered him accordingly. How are we to know that he would say, "Bring your brother here"?' Then Judah said to his father Israel, 'Send the boy in my care and let us be on our way, that we may live and not die, you and we and our children. I myself will be surety for him. You may hold me responsible. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, I shall stand guilty before you forever.'"
So this is pretty incredible what Judah is doing. Judah is the oldest of the first set of brothers, and what we don't have here is that in the middle of this Joseph novella, you all may remember the story of Judah who refused to let his daughter-in-law Tamar marry his next son in line after his son died. This is something called levirate marriage, and it was very common in the ancient world. So if a man died and he had a brother, the brother was supposed to marry the widow so that the line would continue. But Judah refused to give either of his two remaining sons to Tamar. So Tamar tricks Judah. She pretends to be a prostitute, and she entices Judah to have sex with her, which produces a child, ultimately. And she takes from Judah his signet ring and something else that identifies him so that she can prove that this is who the child is. So here is Judah, who's really sort of had this experience where it's clearly changed him. And it's, for me, very powerful when he says, "Look, you can hold me. I will be the surety, so that if Benjamin doesn't come back, you can keep me," or he's going to ask that Benjamin be sent in his care. So I think it really speaks to the ability for people to grow and change because of life experiences, which Judah really does here.
So let me talk about that.
Did
you have a question?
No. Well, I just wondered, again, that gets back to what you were saying about people being put in boxes. So I don't know that anybody could have predicted that Judah would have behaved in this way, understanding how precious Benjamin was to their father. Benjamin is not his full brother, yet really stepping up here. So Judah has changed.
So when we think about changing and looking at ourselves, it talks about growth and gaining insight and introspection to who we are. And it sounds like Judah did that. Joseph eventually seems to try to get there and finding himself after he's toyed with his brothers.
So we move on, and what happens is that Joseph sends the brothers off with grain, but he has another test for them. He asks one of his servants to hide his own personal cup in Benjamin's saddlebag. So with the first light of morning, the men were sent off with their pack animals. They had just left the city, these are the brothers, and not gone far, when Joseph said to his steward, "Up, go after the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, 'Why did you repay good with evil?'" In other words, he gave them this, this grain to take back with them, and they made off with his special cup. "It is the very one from which my master drinks and which he uses for divination. It was a wicked thing for you to do." So Joseph is still obviously foretelling the future, and this is not just a cup he uses on his bedside table to drink water. It's a pretty special cup. So now this is Judah speaking. "Now, if I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us," meaning Benjamin, "since his own life is so bound up with his, when he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die, and your servants will send the white head of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in grief." So this cup has been it's been placed in Benjamin's saddlebag. And Judah is saying, you can't take Benjamin, my father is not going to survive. "Now your servant has pledged himself for the boy to my father, saying, 'If I do not bring him back to you, I shall stand guilty before my father forever. Therefore, please let your servant remain as a slave to my lord instead of the boy, and let the boy go back to be with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be witness to the woe that would overtake my father.'" So at this point, Joseph has an emotional breakthrough. He could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone withdraw from me." So you can imagine, here's this very powerful guy. He's probably surrounded by lots of servants and helpers and officials, and he orders everybody out of the room except the brothers. So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear. And so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still well?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dumbfounded were they on account of him. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come forward to me." And when they came forward, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, he whom you sold into Egypt." Can you imagine how they felt? Oh my goodness. So then he goes on to tell the brothers that he is going to provide for them and ultimately for their father. "There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, that you and your household and all that is yours may not suffer want. You can see for yourselves, and my brother Benjamin for himself, that it is indeed I who am speaking to you. And you must tell my father everything about my high station in Egypt and all that you have seen, and bring my father here with all speed." With that, he embraced his brother Benjamin around the neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. Only then were his brothers able to talk to him. So what do you imagine, Donna, might have led Joseph ultimately to reveal himself to his brothers? I mean, it took a while, as we were saying, he really toyed with them, but what led up, do you think, to his doing.
Sounds like he really did a lot of work internally. I mean, I don't think they had therapy back then. No, but it sounds like Joseph really started to think about these relationships and what they meant to him, and he wanted to reconnect with them. And maybe seeing what his power did to him and how it was more important maybe to reconnect with his family than to have all that power.
So he was able to also make himself vulnerable, because here is this powerful guy who, was in charge of all the rations and in charge of keeping the Egyptians fed and alive. And he had a tremendous amount of power, but there was something in him that he allowed himself to be vulnerable and to be touched.
And it sounds like he felt like he was missing out in his connection with his brothers, especially Benjamin.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of sort of physical contact in this way in the Torah, so all this weeping, all this hugging, is very unusual and I think powerful. And I just imagine that scene as being so poignant. These brothers who have so much hurt and anger between them, and being able to approach each other, not just psychologically, but physically.
And Joseph could have still been angry with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what about that anger? I mean, where does that go? Where does that live? I mean, we talked about that a little bit before, that we don't forget the past, but he certainly probably didn't do away with all of his anger. It was still there somewhere.
But I think somehow he saw his brothers in those relationships, and it meant something. Certainly his relationship with his father was important to him.
So what do you think this little piece of the narrative can teach us about how we can heal or mend relationships that are difficult in our families?
Well, in thinking about difficult relationships, we all probably have one, if not many, many more in our lives, and maybe even some, and we try to figure out the why question, why certain relationships are challenged or why tragedy happens to us. And I think about that book, that Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? And why kind of gets us stuck, why, in figuring out ourselves and how to move forward. So when thinking about difficult relationships, if we could figure out more about being giving and more present, to ourselves and to others, it can help us heal so we can move forward in those relationships. But it's probably one of the hardest things to kind of look at ourselves before we actually look at other relationships.
And as you said before, Joseph's desire to reconnect and to see what he was missing in those connections really helped maybe to tip the balance.
Yeah, and I don't think he saw it till he saw all the brothers there, and especially when he saw Benjamin.
And also the fact that Judah was willing to step up and himself be, in exchange for Benjamin to be held, because Judah may not have done that in the past. So he observed change perhaps in his brothers. And also their concern for the father. This just struck me. I mean, in the narrative where they throw Joseph into the pit, they're perfectly willing to let their father think that Joseph had been killed. Yet here they're expressing concern for their father if Benjamin is not brought back.
Yeah.
So they're able to change. So Donna, would you be willing to read that next section of text?
Sure. Jacob's final blessings. Now your 2 sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, shall be mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine no less than Reuben and Simeon. Noticing Joseph's sons, Israel asked, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons, from God has given me here. Bring them up to me," he said, "that I may bless them." Joseph took the 2 of them, Ephraim with his right hand, to Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand to Israel's right, and brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, thus crossing his hands, although Manasseh was the firstborn. When Joseph saw that his father was placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he thought it was wrong. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's. But his father objected, saying, I know, my son, I know. He too shall become a people, and he too shall be great. Yet his younger brother shall be greater than me, and his offspring shall be plentiful enough for nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, By you shall Israel invoke blessing, saying, God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. And thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh.
So the Hebrew is Yisimcha Elohim Ka'Ephraim V'chim Nasha. And this is the blessing that we say to our sons on Shabbat. It comes from this part of the Torah. So if this story sounds familiar, remember that Jacob was also part of a switcheroo, right? His father Isaac didn't have such great eyesight, and the mom conspired to switch the birthright and the blessing so that Jacob, who was the younger, actually took it from Esau, who was the elder. So we see things repeating, in the generations. But there's something very touching about this because these two boys, Ephraim and Manasseh, are Joseph's sons by, I think her name was Oznat, someone could check that, who was an Egyptian priestess. So in giving this blessing, Jacob is really adopting them as his sons and bringing them back, bringing them into the family, which I find very touching.
And that you don't have to be the firstborn to be great.
You don't have to be the firstborn to be great.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. It also, I think, shows that Jacob is taking a less passive position here, being very definite about who's going to get the blessing first. Because if you remember, when Joseph is giving bad reports of the brothers to the father, Jacob really doesn't do anything. He sort of, keeps things under his hat or, whatever we would say. He doesn't really step in and say, look, this is not going to be a good situation. I mean, he's irritated with Joseph when Joseph shares the dreams and interprets them, but he really is pretty passive. So here, he's changed too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He wants to leave a different kind of legacy, maybe?
Yeah, it seems like that, and it seems like Isaac thought about a lot of things and what he did and maybe what he put Jacob through, and Jacob saw what he put Joseph through, and he wanted it to be something different this time.
Absolutely, absolutely. So to me, this blessing is so touching that it is from this particular part of the Torah, and it represents healing in a family that just had so much pain and anguish, and this is the blessing that we give our sons on Shabbat. The blessing for girls is what you might expect. Maybe be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, okay. But here they're plucking for some reason, and you asked me to look at the history. I didn't really find anything on it. Maybe Cantor Leader knows, but that why pick Ephraim and Manasseh? Why not say Abraham, make you like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? So I think it's Cantor Leader says he doesn't know. So we'll we'll ask Rav Google. Maybe Rav Google would know. But I think it's fascinating that this is the blessing that we give our sons on Shabbat. It's kind of unexpected, I think. So you mentioned, Donna, about not putting people in a box. I think that's another very important lesson here.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Donna, anything else you want to say about the narrative itself before we have some questions and conversation?
I'd be curious, actually, what people thought about Jacob switching Manasseh and Ephraim.
Yep. I would be interested as well. Yep. And if you, in addition to that, there are the questions at the end of the text sheet about our own family relationships, several other questions as well. So I know Cantor Leader is collecting your questions, and people who are watching at home may have emailed. And any questions that people have, Cantor Leader will relay.
So I would say that right now we only have one question emailed in. Bring them in. And I think we're a small enough group where, as long as you allow me to hold the microphone so we're not passing it around, that you can just ask your questions. So we'll do that. Let's start
Our
with
leader will mask up when he does that so that we can.
you bet.
Yeah, great, super.
Okay.
Thank you. Question. Like Joseph, how do you suggest we move past the zero-sum game win-lose stakes that are required in order to forgive those who we believe have harmed us?
When you say zero-sum game, Ellen?
There has to be a winner, there has to be a loser. If I forgive you, then I'm losing something of my identity or my autonomy or my power or my authority. I have to give something up in order to create a space for you. How do we move past those stakes to create a more level playing field?
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking about forgiveness. Do we lose something or do we gain something by forgiving? It feels very vulnerable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to make ourselves vulnerable, and that's a very scary thing.
And we don't know what the other person's reaction is going to be. Yeah.
Can you repeat that so that everybody knows?
What is the process of getting there? How do you suggest we lay out a process that we can take that journey to get to that place?
Probably would an example would be helpful, but I guess is thinking about what are you looking for when you're thinking about opening up talking about it and being vulnerable. You know, what are we looking for? If we're looking for the other person to have this big revelation or change, that's probably not going to happen. So I would really think about, what am I looking for? And sometimes, you know, forgiveness, I know on Yom Kippur it says, you know, to talk to the other person, but sometimes it might be an internal dialogue first about what are we looking for when we want to talk to the other person about how they've hurt us. Because we certainly don't want to shift the power dynamic, if that person has been in a power situation with you.
So one thing that sometimes I used to suggest to people, and years ago when I was a therapist, and it's also worked in my family, is to let somebody know in advance that you don't ambush them. In other words, to through an email or maybe a note, say, I would really welcome a chance to talk with you, and to pick a place that's neutral. Perhaps now that we can go to coffee shops again, where there are other people around, where you have some privacy, but I think generally we all are better behaved in public than we are in private. So that can be sort of the beginning of having that kind of a conversation, and seeing where it goes from there.
So we've got an email with a comment and a couple questions from Abby. And she says,
Hi, Abby.
she says you're funny.
Thank you, Abby. Well, you should know that Abby was a student of mine, so she's. Thank you, Abby. I love you, Abby.
She can't believe her family. Wait, no.
My family.
Yeah, I can't believe your family.
I know, it's
said
unbelievable,
that you were
isn't it?
the serious one.
I know.
And we all think that way. Yeah. Why do families pinpoint each family member to take on a particular role? The smart one, the funny one, the rebel, which was my sister. It's harmful, hurtful, and stupid. That's the first question.
Well, families are systems, right? And when I was in social work school, we studied family systems theory, and in order for a system to be in some sort of balance, everybody sort of has to play a role. And that's the way that families function. And if somebody's going to come out of that role or do something that's radically different, say if Cantor Leader had said, I'm going to be the wild and crazy one, that would have upset the homeostasis in his family system.
And sometimes we're in roles in family to be the healer or to be the person who ends up being, quote unquote, the patient in the family.
And her second question is in a similar vein. What do therapists counsel families in regards to having a favorite child? Is it discouraged, or in some families, could they accept that one kid is the favorite? And maybe if not okay, families should at least admit that one child is favored over others, and that they can try to cope with that. I feel this is a very common dynamic in families that is not openly addressed.
That is true. You know, we do encourage parents to kind of look at their own dynamics and why they, I mean, it may seem like one child's favored because it might be the child that actually is the person that speaks out or wants more attention. But that may not, I mean, favored child, everybody has different roles, especially when you think about if there was a sick child in the family, you know, they may get more attention. And it may seem like they're being favored, but it's really that they need more attention and care, and the other children in the family or siblings, you know, don't get as much attention and they feel left out. So it all really depends on the family dynamic. I think parents, we all can relate maybe to some kids in a particular way or have similar interests, but it may not be favored. I don't know. It depends.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as a parent, sometimes it's easier to relate to a child who communicates the way that you do. You know,
Yeah.
I have one that is that way and one that I had to work a little bit harder at for the two of us to find a way to communicate because we're very different in terms of how we communicate. So, you know, I have a daughter and a son, so I would joke, oh, you're my favorite son, you're my favorite daughter, haha. But I think when you have one that is easier to make a connection with, you know, it can be challenging to make a connection with children who may not be so easy to connect with.
Yeah, and it may be with your own siblings when taking care of your parents, too. I know in my family, you know, it tends to be that I'm the one who ends up being more the lead in certain family dynamics, but it may be just because of proximity and parents relating to you in a different way or your relationship with them growing up.
Well, and that also introduces something that you and I spoke about, Donna, which is at a certain point in life, we're working with our siblings to take care of our parents, perhaps, who need care. And these relationships with siblings that may have not been the best or the easiest are really put to the test here. And maybe that offers, back to your point, Ellen, an opportunity to approach people, if they're siblings with whom we've had difficult relationships, to say, you know what, we need to work together to help dad or to help mom. Let's see if we can figure out a way to do that. And I think that can be healing also.
Mm-hmm. And also trying to accept what people, you know, their limitations, what people can and can't give.
So this conversation created for me a different view of the story that we look at it a little bit differently, and that's one of resilience. It occurs to me that something very bad happened to Joseph, and he lived a life. So this isn't immediacy, and at the end of struggles, whatever they were, jail and all this business, something good happened to him. A very good thing happened to him. So he was able, so when he reconnects with his son, it's interesting, or his brothers, I think he knows that despite what happened, how hard, look what happened. And so there can be I don't know if it's a lesson or a reminder to folks that no matter how bad it may seem at the moment, that there will be a time that hopefully we can all look back and say, but for that, I would not be here. And not that you would ever necessarily want it to happen that way, but that as a result, you find yourself in a better place. I don't know how that fits into the dialogue, but it occurs to me that I would not have expected Joseph to bear that anger all those years later. Had it happened, 6 months later, that might have been a different story.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, Sam, I think that's a really great point. When tragedy hits, you're so full of pain, hurt, anger. It's hard to imagine that you're going to get out of that and grow and be on the other side. But that's exactly, it sounds like, in your interpretation, and I think that's right, what Joseph did. He was able to get to the other side after knowing that his brothers left him in a pit. He was able to get to the other side and forgive and heal them. And in the moment of hurt and pain, we can't even imagine something like that happening. But that is something. But if we allow ourselves to forgive and feel and push through the anger and deal with whatever emotions, we can grow to the other side.
And also, this family is resilient when you think about it. I mean, isn't this like the last family in the world that you would think would be able to reunite? So it's inspiring in a way. If they can do it, right, then maybe we can do it. So there's some sort of force in this family that they want to be together despite all the mishigas, right?
Yeah, and the pandemic has certainly opened up opportunities sort of maybe in a less vulnerable way by so many families doing Zoom calls or getting together. It allows an opportunity to sort of reconnect with maybe just sort of putting our toe out there and talking to people. And now that everything's opened up, I know a lot of people have talked about that there's a lot of anxiety with re-entering and all these things opening up, expectations and stuff, and maybe reflecting back what our priorities are and what did we learn during this pandemic and what do we want to do to take it forward.
And no matter how successful Joseph was, and he was very successful, he was missing something.
Mm-hmm.
His heart was really torn, and it wasn't enough, all of his success.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if you can hear me. I find this fascinating how it relates to today's, how current and modern this story seems. I'm really curious, you had asked about what people's reaction were to Jacob giving the blessing to the younger versus the older. And could you just give us some context of what that meant to be given a blessing? And how would you relate that to what we as parents want to give blessings to our children? Like, what does that equate to? Is it that we want them to be successful? Is it that we do these things to, encourage them to be a better person? I just find it fascinating.
So, Lisa, I wanted to make sure I understood the first part. You mean in the ancient world? And okay, so I can handle that, and then I'll toss the rest to you, Donna. So, in the ancient world, that was really important because it went to the oldest son, and the oldest son would be the person who would carry on the name and would be the head of the household, the bait. So that was very, very significant to have that blessing. So it's not in the same way that we might think of a blessing that we would give our kids on a Friday night. It had some power and some concrete things attached to it. But both in this case and in the case of Jacob and Esau, there was some feeling somewhere that the younger one, Jacob, and in this case, I guess is it Menashe or Ephraim? I got so confused. But in any case, that perhaps the younger one was the more fit heir. So in a way, this was sort of radical. But the traditional way, and of course this did not go to girls, eventually the daughters of Zelophehad, who we read about this past couple of Torah portions, their father died without any male heirs, and so they petitioned Moses, and Moses went to God, and God said, okay, they can inherit, as long as their property stays they can't marry anybody outside their tribe. But it went from the father to his male heirs. So I'll leave the psychotherapeutic part of it to you.
Well, I was also thinking about the fact that Jacob switched his hands, and we were talking about favorites. I think he was also making a statement about that, maybe these two brothers, they're, it doesn't have to be the oldest to be the favorite or to carry on a tradition, that maybe, they are who they are, and each can bring some different gifts to the nation, to Israel and stuff. So I'm not sure I answered your question. Yeah.
So, I think it's a good question. Like, how do we bless our children now? How do we say what we really want to say to them?
What do we want for them in their lives, right?
Well, I think about what we always say, that the most precious gift is peace, and peace comes in different forms. And sometimes we get caught up in, especially in this area, like, where do they go to school? What are they doing? Did they marry? Who did they marry? Where do they live? And all these things versus, are they kind? Are they happy? Do they have friends? Do they have a support system? Have they launched? And can they take care of themselves? That those are really going to be the things that are going to allow them to have, I think, the most peace in their life.
So putting priorities and values up front. And we also have a tradition of making an ethical will for our children to let them know what we feel is important. But also, I would say it's important for us to share these feelings and desires that we have with our children in terms of what we hope and want. I heard a very touching story the other day of someone who was in the process of dying, who was able to say to their children, what I want for all of you is to be happy. To me, that's a blessing. And we don't have to wait till that point to say it. This is something that we can tell our children, and we should, throughout their lives, that what is really important, as you said, Donna, is the kind of people that they are.
Mm-hmm.
So other comments or questions?
Okay, I want to thank John and Graham for their support on video and audio, much appreciated. And Stephanie and Donna for kicking off this amazing summer series, helping us to struggle with broken relationships and families. And there's a lot more to come. Mm-hmm. And next week, Rabbi Sachs and Dr. Melissa Sporn will talk about Jacob and Esau. And the complication of being twins. So
to this,
yeah. I think every week's going to add to where we were
your
today.
Family had problems.
That's right.
And Cantor Leader, also thank you to you for getting us going and organizing us and bringing us another wonderful summer Limud.
Okay. Hopefully we'll see you all next week. We'll see you all next week. And thank